Subcommittee on Federal Lands will come to order. My apologies for being late this morning. Without objection, the chair is authorized to declare a recess of the subcommittee at any time. The subcommittee is meeting today. Consider four bills. H.R. 1727 from Representative Trone, H.R. 5283 from Representative Malliotakis, the Protecting Our Communities from Failure to Secure the Border Act of 2023, my legislation, a discussion draft of the Trash Reduction and Suppressing Harm from Environmental Degradation at the Border Act, or Trashed Border Act, a discussion draft offered by the full committee chairman, Chairman Westerman, the Ensuring Border Access and Protection on Federal Land Act. I ask unanimous consent that Representative Malliotakis of New York be allowed to participate in today's hearing from the dais. Without objection, so ordered. Welcome, Representative Malliotakis. Under Committee Rule 4F, any oral opening statements at hearings are limited to the chairman and the ranking minority member. I therefore ask unanimous consent that all other members' opening statements be made part of the hearing record if they are submitted in accordance with Committee Rule 3, Parent O. Without objection, so ordered. I will now recognize myself for an opening statement. $5.7 billion, that is the number of fatal doses of fentanyl that have flowed across our southern border in the past year. 5.7 billion, enough fatal doses to kill the entire U.S. population 17 times over. The Biden administration's failed border policies have led to record numbers of migrant crossings and drug seizures reported this year. Since President Biden took office, more than 6 million illegal immigrants have crossed our southern border into the United States. This crisis is now spilling onto our federal lands, which make up approximately 35% of the total 1,965 miles along the border. Large piles of trash, unauthorized trails, wildfires, and even illegal marijuana grow sites are degrading our public lands and imperiling recreation and access for every American. Enough is enough. The bills before us today will secure our porous border, halt environmental degradation caused by illegal immigration, and ensure our national parks and public lands remain places for public enjoyment, not camps for illegal immigrants. I'd like to highlight legislation we will consider during today's hearing that I'm offering, the Trashed Border Act. As somebody who has seen and been to our southern border many times, I can speak firsthand to the amount of trash that piles up as a result of illegal immigration. It's estimated that each illegal immigrant will discard between 6 to 8 pounds of trash as they illegally cross our border. Cartels are also discarding trash, toxic chemicals, and banned pesticides at illegal marijuana grow sites on federal lands. Illegal immigration is harming wildlife, destroying habitat, and damaging our natural resources. My legislation would direct the agencies to implement protocols to limit the amount of waste discarded on our border, as well as require public reports about the amount of trash collected to ensure there's greater attention and transparency brought to this issue. I'd also like to highlight Representative Malliotakis' legislation, which would prevent federal land managers, including the National Park Service, from housing illegal immigrants on federal lands. This bill is a continuation of the committee's oversight on this issue, including our full committee hearing last month. To those who may oppose this legislation, I ask you one simple question. If you are willing to let it happen in New York City, are you willing to let it happen in the Grand Canyon, in Yosemite, in national parks in your district? I certainly won't allow the National Park Service to set up new migrant camps at the Apostle Islands National Lakeshore in my district. Each of these bills represents an important step in securing our border and protecting our parks, and I look forward to working with my colleagues to expeditiously move them through committee. Before I yield to the ranking member, I'd like to express my disappointment at the empty chair at our witness table for the Department of Interior and where they're supposed to be. Following standard practice, this subcommittee gave Department more than 2 weeks' notice for today's hearing, and we worked diligently to accommodate a witness from any of the department's bureaus. Unlike the Forest Service, they chose not to be here today, and even went so far as to suggest that the bills on today's hearing, which affect lands under the department's jurisdiction, would be best spoken to by agencies without jurisdiction over those lands. It is unacceptable. This committee and the American people will demand transparency from the Biden administration and senior officials like Secretary Haaland, particularly on topics of national importance such as securing our southern border. With that, I will now recognize Ranking Member Neguse for his opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Grateful to the witnesses for being here today, and of course to members on both sides of the aisle for joining us for this important subcommittee hearing. I do want to first just say, after the chaotic last few weeks, certainly pleased to be back in front of the subcommittee, and I do appreciate the inclusion of a bill from one of my Democratic colleagues for this legislative hearing. As the chairman knows, when I chaired this subcommittee produced hearings on more Republican and Democratic bills than any other subcommittee in the United States House of Representatives. This subcommittee has a long legacy and history of being bipartisan in nature. Of course, that was the case when I had the pleasure of serving with Ranking Member Fulcher. And so I want to thank the chairman for, I hope, continuing that practice in upcoming hearings and perhaps putting more bills from my colleagues on both sides of the aisle before this particular subcommittee. I'm looking forward to hearing more about Representative Trone's proposal to reauthorize the Chesapeake and Ohio Canal National Historic Park Advisory Committee through 2034. The commission works to ensure that local communities have a voice in the operation, maintenance, and restoration of the Chesapeake and Ohio Canal National Park, which hosts more than 5 million visitors annually. And again, these are the types of bills and solutions that I'm proud we consider in this subcommittee, common sense legislation introduced by Republican and Democratic members that ultimately ensures the continued collaboration of our communities. Now, I am concerned that some of the other bills that we are considering today, and this is, in my humble view, seek to score political points rather than ultimately solve problems. And I'm even more concerned that some of these bills, I don't know if we can call them bills because I believe they're discussion drafts, which is not something that this subcommittee at least was engaged in customarily when I chaired the subcommittee, putting forth bills that are not yet ready for prime time, but nonetheless asking witnesses, including administration witnesses, to opine on them. In any event, there are multiple bills that have no direct connection to the jurisdiction of this particular subcommittee. And I want to be clear, because although we have different views as to the substance of Ms. Malitanakis' bill, I do believe her bill does have a connection to this committee's jurisdiction. But the two discussion draft bills that we're considering certainly don't. And in my view, I would think that this committee would have a litany of different issues germane to the jurisdiction of this subcommittee that we should be considering. I, of course, agree that we have a crisis at our southern border, and it is a policy issue and a funding issue that has long required comprehensive solutions and increased resources for our enforcement agencies. I have been disappointed that so many of my colleagues on the other side of the aisle, when faced with this crisis, have instead doubled down on calls from some members of their conference to defund law enforcement, to defund the Department of Homeland Security, to defund the FBI, to defund the DEA. I certainly don't agree with the position that some of my colleagues on the other side of the aisle have taken in regards to that. I think we should be providing more resources to those law enforcement agencies. I also think, to the extent that one is arguing, is that I believe the chairman of the subcommittee and the chairman of the full committee are arguing that the National Park Service or the U.S. Forest Service should have some role with respect to these issues, that we shouldn't be cutting funding for those agencies either. And yet that's exactly what the Republican House Conference has proposed for the next fiscal year. Drastic, deep, draconian cuts to the Department of Interior, to the National Park Service, to the Forest Service. And yet, simultaneously, proposing, as I said, not bills, but discussion drafts that would impose a variety of different mandates that are unfunded in nature. So I'm disappointed. I know the chairman made note of the Department of Interior and the fact that they don't have a witness here. I must say, I was hoping that I might be able to ask some questions of I don't know, the Department of Homeland Security, since they have primary jurisdiction over our southern border, but they're not at this hearing either. Why? Well, because Republicans didn't invite them to this hearing, and it makes sense. This isn't the Homeland Security Committee. This isn't the Immigration Subcommittee of the Judiciary Committee, on which I actually have served. I was hoping I might be able to ask some questions of Customs and Border Control. CBP might have something to say about the issues that we're discussing today. But my understanding from Democratic staff is that they weren't invited either. They found out about one of these discussion drafts from Democratic staff. So I know I'm out of time, and I appreciate the chairman's indulgence as always. I would just simply say I'm hoping that after we conclude this hearing, we can get back to the way in which this subcommittee has historically been run, and the way in which I think it's been run for much of this year. So with that, I yield back.
Yeah, thank you to the ranking member. I'll now recognize the chairman of the full committee, Mr. Westerman.
Thank you, Chairman Tiffany, for holding this hearing. Thank you to the witnesses for being here today. And the bills we're considering, including Chairman Tiffany's legislation, are of great importance, not only to our committee, but to our nation as a whole. I want to read a quote to you. There is presently an acute and immediate need to conduct physical barriers and roads in the vicinity of the border of the United States in order to prevent unlawful entries into the United States, end quote. You may be surprised that I'm not quoting myself or any other Republican member of Congress for that matter, but rather a Federal Register notice the Biden administration published exactly 2 weeks ago when they announced they would waive 26 federal laws, including NEPA, ESA, and the National Historic Preservation Act, to build roads and a wall along our border in Texas, including in the Lower Rio Grande Valley National Wildlife Refuge. Any of you who have been to our southern border would know this Federal Register statement is an accurate one, and ironically, it's the current policies that this Congress and the administration could change. It's those policies that have created this crisis in the first place. I've been to the southern border, like Chairman Tiffany, many times, including our federal borderlands. These are supposed to be some of our most protected places: wildlife refuges, national parks, and national monuments. Instead, they are littered with discarded trash, unauthorized trails are cut through sensitive habitat, and they are some of the most targeted areas for criminals, drug smugglers, and human traffickers. Last Congress, committee Republicans held a forum on the environmental impacts of illegal immigration on our southern border. We heard testimony from Border Patrol agents who said that federal borderlands are particularly susceptible to illegal crossings because they are remote, uninhabited, and less frequently patrolled. Border Patrol agents also identified a lack of reliable access as their top concern for securing our border and protecting the safety of agents and the public. Now, I remember the very first trip I made to the border, and I flew in a helicopter the entire Arizona border and in other areas, and the remoteness of this area is what struck me. But also what struck me was the Border Patrol agents tell me their number one concern was they had no access to the border, and especially on some of the federal lands where you couldn't have wheeled vehicles. So there's places where our border was wide open, and the only way a Border Patrol agent could get there was to either be dropped in by a helicopter, to ride a horse, or to hike. So you can imagine what kind of lack of security those areas of the border have. And according to the National Border Patrol Council, the inability to build proper border access roads in the Coronado National Forest diminished agent mobility while patrolling and ultimately prevented agents from being as effective as they could be otherwise. That's why I'm sponsoring the Ensuring Border Access and Protection on Federal Lands Act. This is a common sense legislation that will secure our federal borderlands and stop putting Border Patrol agents in harm's way. Now, my friend Nagoose, I'm not sure where he went, but if we're talking about building a road on federal lands, I think that has a direct nexus to this committee. Yes, it has Homeland Security implications as well, but we're the committee with jurisdiction over federal lands. We're the committee with jurisdiction over NEPA and the permitting process. This is common sense legislation. It would require federal land managers to construct navigable roads along federal lands, which make up 35% of the total miles along the border. The agencies would be required to work with the Department of Homeland Security to construct fencing, physical barriers, and surveillance technology to accompany these roads. There are very tenuous borders around the world that are protected with high-tech fencing and roads, and it doesn't have to be a wall everywhere, but you have to be able to have access to get to these places. The ironic thing about our legislation is that it requires the construction of these roads to comply with NEPA. One of the laws the Biden administration decided to waive this month for their own construction. You won't find anything in our bill that waives NEPA. I look forward to discussion today on this bill, as well as Chairman Tiffany's and Representative Malliotakis's legislation. I want to thank our witnesses again for being here. Say hi to my friend Troy Hethiker. Glad to see you up here, Troy, but we really miss you on the Ouachita National Forest back in Arkansas, where you did such a fine job. And I would also like to echo Chairman Tiffany's disappointment at the empty chair next to you that was reserved for the Department of Interior. We're grateful the Forest Service decided to show up and answer questions about an important topic. And with that, I yield back.
Yeah, thank you, Chairman Westerman. We'll move on to our first panel now, which for members who are sponsoring bills today. And first, I'm going to recognize Representative Malliotakis for 5 minutes on H.R. 5283.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I want to thank the committee for holding this hearing on my legislation, H.R. 5283, Protecting Our Communities from Failure to Secure the Border Act. And I would like to thank this committee staff for working with my office in the drafting of this bill. The administration's failure to secure the border has resulted in an unprecedented number of individuals flooding into our country and ultimately finding their way to some of our most northern communities. New York City Mayor Eric Adams wrongfully insists that a 1982 right to shelter decree, court decree, requires taxpayers to house an unlimited number of citizens from outside of New York and the nation. He has since taken over schools, parks, and assisted living facilities meant for our seniors. As of the beginning of this month, New York City has taken on the burden of 118,000 migrants and currently housing upwards of 64,000 individuals at a tremendous expense and burden on the taxpayer. So much so that Mayor Adams said that it will, quote, destroy, unquote, New York City, and proposed a 15% across-the-board cut of city services. Instead of closing the border, this administration has agreed to turn over our national park into a migrant encampment to accommodate 2,500 migrants at Floyd Bennett Field in Brooklyn, which is part of the Gateway National Recreation Area. This is lands under the jurisdiction of the National Park Service. Doing so without going through the proper NEPA process, the Department of Interior is beholden to. I want to thank Chairman Bruce Westerman for coming to Floyd Bennett Field last month and seeing firsthand the issue, and then subsequently holding a hearing on this. The week following this committee's hearing on the issue, heavy rains flooded Floyd Bennett Field as much as 10 inches, proving the point that this is in no way the appropriate place to house anyone. Created by an act of Congress in 1972, 5 months before our friend, the late Don Young of Alaska, joined this institution, Gateway National Recreation Area was one of the first urban parks in the national park system. I must also point out that its creation, Congress prohibited the construction of a housing development at Floyd Bennett Field. Gateway National Recreation Area may not be to the scale of our more well-known parks out west, but it is one of our urban treasures in New York City. The portion of Gateway National Recreation Area in my district contains Fort Wadsworth, which is one of the nation's oldest military installations, and it currently serves as a domicile and an operational base for members of the U.S. Coast Guard and the U.S. Park Police, who are tasked with patrolling not only the parklands, but also New York Harbor from potential national security threats. That park was also being proposed as a potential site to house migrants from other countries. The portion of Gateway National, I'm sorry, this is why my legislation, H.R. 5283, is so important and straightforward. This legislation prohibits the use of federal funds to provide housing to migrants on any land under the administrative jurisdiction of the federal land management agencies, specifically naming the National Park Service, the Bureau of Land Management, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and the U.S. Forest Service. This legislation protects our lands nationwide, not just those in New York City. And before I close, I must remind my colleagues here of the mission of the National Park Service. The National Park Service preserves, unimpaired, the natural and cultural resources and values of the national park system for the enjoyment, education, and inspiration of this and future generations. The National Park Service cooperates with partners to extend the benefits of natural and cultural resource conservation and outdoor recreation throughout this country and the world. Taxpayers of New York City and the United States of America preserve these lands for their public use, for their recreational activities and enjoyment. And I thank you for your time and consideration of my legislation. I look forward to it moving through the committee process. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Representative Malliotakis. We're now going to move on to our second panel, the four that are with us here. Let me remind the witnesses that under committee rules, you must limit your oral statement to 5 minutes, but your entire statement will appear in the hearing record. To begin your testimony, please press the on button on the microphone. We use timing lights. When you begin, the light will turn green. At the end of 5 minutes, the light will turn red. And I'll ask you to please complete your statement at that time. At this time, I would have liked to recognize Secretary of Interior Deb Haaland. As you can see, there is an empty seat at our witness table where she should be testifying. Therefore, I will move on and introduce Mr. Troy Heithacker, Associate Deputy Chief at the U.S. Forest Service. Associate Deputy Chief Heithacker, thank you. Thank you for being willing to be here today, and you are recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, and good morning, Chairman Tiffany. Full committee chairman, Westerman, good to see you as well, and ranking member Neguse if he returns, and other members of the subcommittee. Thank you for the opportunity to testify today on the proposed legislation related to illegal entry and associated environmental concerns along the southern border. My name is Troy Heithacker. I currently serve as an Associate Deputy Chief for the National Forest System. I've been a career employee with the Forest Service for over 25 years and have worked from Alaska to Arkansas and now here in Washington, D.C. The Forest Service manages 193 million acres of public lands in 44 states, the Virgin Islands and Puerto Rico. These lands play a pivotal role in providing the public with myriad opportunities and benefits, from recreation to forest products. Law enforcement is an integral part of our mission, and partnerships are fundamental to our ability to deliver that mission. These partnerships extend to the U.S. Customs and Border Protection by providing support to fulfill their mission to secure the nation's borders. Border management issues are a significant concern for the Forest Service. There are 1.5 million acres of National Forest System lands within 50 miles of the southern border, and 60 miles of the Coronado National Forest in Arizona are contiguous with the Mexico border. The natural and cultural resources on the Coronado are of regional, national, and international importance. There are 12 separate and uniquely distinct mountain ranges, 8 designated wilderness areas, and approximately 174 threatened, endangered, or sensitive species in the Coronado. These remarkable lands welcome between 1.4 and 2.9 visitors annually. The Ensuring Border Access and Protection on Federal Land Act directs the Secretary of Agriculture and the Secretary of Interior to construct roads on federal lands along the United States southern border to prevent illegal crossings in areas of high illegal entry and gain operational control of the border. Implementation of the bill would require the construction and reconstruction of 45 to 55 miles of roads along the Coronado National Forest and Mexico border on steep and rocky terrain, some not suitable for roads. With the current annual budget for road construction, operations, and maintenance, it would be difficult to meet the proposed timelines and would add to the existing road maintenance backlog. Additionally, there are sections of the border inside the boundaries of the Pajarito Wilderness Area where the road construction is not allowed. The bill also proposes limiting access to U.S. Customs and Border Protection personnel, law enforcement officials, emergency response personnel, and other personnel as determined by the Secretary of Agriculture. This is a popular area for public recreation, and maintaining public access is important. In addition, the U.S. Customs and Border Protection has previously requested the Forest Service maintain public access to existing roads for purposes of not impeding their rapid access when needed. USDA has concerns with this draft legislation and welcomes the opportunity to work with the committee to explain these concerns more fully. The Protecting Our Communities from Failure to Secure the Border Act would prevent the Forest Service and other federal agencies from providing federal funds that might be used to provide housing to certain non-citizens. The Forest Service does not provide funds to certain non-citizens for any purposes, including housing. USDA believes that H.R. 5283 is not necessary given that the proposed provisions are already consistent with current Forest Service management practices. Therefore, USDA does not support this legislation. The Trash Reduction and Suppressing Harm from Environmental Degradation at the Border Act would direct the Secretary of Agriculture to establish and implement policies and protocols to prevent and mitigate environmental degradation caused by certain non-citizens on NFS lands along the southern border. The Clean Water Act, Clean Air Act, and other laws already provide the authorities to protect the environment. The Forest Service currently prohibits activities such as littering, damaging property, and resource degradation under current regulations, and therefore does not believe this requirement in the bill is necessary. We recognize that litter is a persistent problem on national forest lands, and despite trash collection efforts of Coronado National Forest employees, along with the help of partners and volunteers, the overall amount of trash continues to rise annually. This bill would also direct the Secretary to submit to Congress a report on the amount of waste collected on NFS lands where certain non-citizens are being housed or sheltered, and on any sites on NFS lands where certain non-citizens have illegally cultivated controlled substances. Nationwide, waste deposition, illegal camping and encroachment, illegal grow sites, and human-caused wildfires are caused by non-citizens and citizens. While the agency tracks the number and extent of human-caused wildfires, the agency does not currently track these damages by citizenships or legal statuses, and in many cases, it would prove difficult or impossible to do so. Section 4 of the bill also directs the Secretary to double the fines and penalties only for non-citizens for activities prohibited under applicable fire and sanitation regulations. USDA defers to the U.S. Department of Justice for its views on the provision. USDA would appreciate the opportunity to continue to work with committee as it further drafts this bill. Chairman Tiffany, members of the subcommittee, this concludes my remarks, and I look forward to answering any questions you may have.
Thank you, Mr. Heithaker. I'd like to now introduce Dr. George Lewis, the chair of the C&O Canal National Historical Park Federal Advisory Commission. Dr. Lewis, you have 5 minutes.
Thank you, and good morning to the entire subcommittee. I am Dr. George Lewis, chair of the Chesapeake and Ohio Canal National Historical Park Commission, here today in response to your kind invitation to testify on behalf of H.R. 1727, a bill which simply proposes to extend the Commission's life until September of 2034. The park is enormous in length, 184.5 miles, having been cobbled together way back in 1971 from private, state, and federal holdings along the shoreline of the Potomac River. Congress at that time envisioned correctly that with this diverse acquisition would come considerable controversy, and Congress was right, and thus concurrently authorized a commission that could provide the diverse jurisdictions bordering this new park a seat at the table on topics involving the park and its environ. The commission, therefore, is composed of local folks, is composed of 19 volunteers, 2 each from 4 Maryland counties bordering the park, 2 each recommended by the governors of Virginia, West Virginia, Maryland, and the District of Columbia, and 3, including the chair, are appointed directly by the Secretary of Interior. Commissioners serve for 5 years or until replaced. The commission is apolitical, and its commissioners bring with them a vast treasure of public and private sector experience and expertise to draw upon when advising the Secretary of Interior on matters involving the administration and the development of the park. The duties of the Commission are solely advisory. The Commission reports through the Superintendent of the C&O Canal Historic Park up its food chain to the Secretary of Interior. The Commission holds public meetings, at best 2 to 3 times a year, to receive input from the public and to address public concerns as appropriate. The Commission's high value to the Park Superintendent, the National Park Service, the Secretary of Interior, and the park's neighbors, visitors, and congressional constituents lies not only in its vast experience and diverse expertise, but as well as in the Commission's ability to communicate successfully with each and all of these entities. For your convenience, I have provided the committee with 3 supporting documents: a brief description of the park, a brief description of the mission of the park, and very importantly, in my opinion, the professional expertise of each of the commissioners. It's a multiple-page document, but it gives you a pretty good idea of all the expertise that we get free. And each of these volunteers are associated with the park also by using it, whether it's hiking, biking, bird watching, whatever. I envision this committee or this commission as like the old Leatherman pocket knife, multifaceted, multi-tool that is there to be used in multiple ways, both as the superintendent, as the Secretary of Interior, as Congress. Tools with screwdrivers that can unscrew things, can sharpen things, can file things, etc. And it's a tool that's easy to use by everyone. So I want to thank you for your consideration and your time. I encourage this august body to act favorably on H.R. 1727. I am now available to answer any questions you may have.
Thank you, Dr. Lewis. I now recognize Mr. Simon Hankinson, a senior research fellow at the Border Security and Immigration Center of the Heritage Foundation. Mr. Hankinson, you have 5 minutes.
Chairman Tiffany, Ranking Member Neguse, and members of the subcommittee, thank you for inviting me to testify today regarding the impact on and use of federal lands in our present border crisis. In my former career as a Foreign Service officer, I interviewed thousands of foreign applicants for U.S. visas, from immigrants to students and visitors. I was required to uphold the law and to use my professional judgment as to whether each applicant was qualified. Under the Constitution, Congress decides who is admitted into the country and under what conditions. However, the Biden administration has failed in its duty to enforce immigration law. For more than 2 years, over 150,000 foreign nationals have attempted to illegally cross our borders every month. This August saw 304,000 such encounters, the highest monthly total in U.S. history, and September will likely break that record. These huge numbers don't even include at least 1.7 million other aliens who are estimated to have entered illegally without being encountered or identified by U.S. authorities since January 2021. The evidence is clear. The administration's management of our borders has been disastrous. The Department of Homeland Security processes inadmissible aliens at a mass scale and moves them quickly into the interior, either in nominal removal proceedings that will take years to conclude or under made-up programs that pervert the meaning of immigration parole. To justify its departure from historical precedent, the Biden administration has insisted that those whose asylum applications were denied would be removed from the United States consistent with our laws. In fact, the administration has removed fewer than 1% of the aliens released since January 2021. President Biden's border policies have resulted in numerous failures. The first failure is allowing illegal border crossers to enter and remain in the country. This undermines the rule of law. Millions of foreign relatives of U.S. citizens wait their turn in the legal immigration system, allowing millions of others to short-circuit the process and take all the advantages of being a legal immigrant without any fee, any weight, or any background check is simply unjust. Furthermore, the class-wide use of parole by the Biden administration violates the law. Immigration should be in the national interest, not just a political interest. The second failure is releasing masses of aliens at the border when we know nothing about them, which results in preventable crime. There are already over 400,000 convicted illegal alien criminals walking free in our communities. The administration's annual target for deporting them is under 30,000. President Biden thus asks Americans to run the risks posed by recidivist foreign criminals instead of their home countries. The third failure is to make it easy for potential terrorists to enter the country. In fiscal 2023, over 160 people on the terrorist watch list were caught crossing U.S. borders. Since 2021, 70,000 special interest aliens from countries known to harbor terrorists like Afghanistan, Syria, and Iran were encountered and often released with no knowledge of their true histories. In addition to these policy failures, the American taxpayer has been saddled with increased burdens, including $78 billion a year for public schools and $23 billion a year in excess medical expenses. Today's hearing is about the use of federal lands, which account for nearly 700 miles of the U.S.-Mexico border. Building roads along the border to regain operational control and deter illegal crossing is a judicious use of public land in the national interest. Assessing the environmental damage caused to federal lands by illegal immigration and coming up with ways to prevent and mitigate that destruction is a valuable effort to conserve public property. However, using federal lands to house inadmissible aliens would both subvert the public benefit for which the land was conserved and fail to solve the problem. From El Paso to Boston, the U.S. cities are paying the price of mass illegal immigration. New York City alone is spending more than $5 billion a year housing illegal aliens, and running out of space, New York now wants to use federal land. Allowing such use would be a mistake. Reports from Guatemala down to the Darien Gap indicate that mass migration, facilitated by this administration, is only going to grow. With no effort to control the flow from the south, locals would be deprived indefinitely of the use of public land that is diverted for migrant shelters. Absent a change in national policy, U.S. localities like New York are going to have to deal with increasing flows for at least another year and the downstream effects and costs for many years. There will never be enough taxpayer money or federal land to compensate cities and states for Biden's failed border strategy. The more that U.S. elected officials come to accept the current chaos as normal, the harder it's going to be to return to a more sustainable management of our borders. The Biden administration should reverse its reckless policies in the interests of national and local security. Legislation to physically secure the border, ameliorate environmental damage caused by unchecked illegal immigration, and to stop federal lands being diverted for short-term Band-Aid solutions would move us in the right direction. Thank you, and I'm happy to take your questions.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Hankinson. I'd like to now recognize Representative Malliotakis to introduce our next witness.
My pleasure. Thank you again, Mr. Chairman. I'm fortunate to have a good friend from New York City who is a Republican councilwoman from Queens. And to my colleagues, I would like to welcome my fellow New Yorker, City Councilwoman JoAnn Ariello, back to this committee. She was here recently where she testified regarding the use of Floyd Bennett Field being turned into a migrant encampment, which was last month, and we're happy to have her here again. She's a lifelong resident of Queens in the district that she represents. She's a committed civic leader, a wife, a mother, a grandmother, and she has always focused her activism on forging positive relationship between the residents of Queens and government agencies to promote high-quality education for students, improving the quality of life that residents deserve, and working with the NYPD on issues related to public safety. She is a trusted representative for the communities within the 32nd Council District. She's someone who has worked across the aisle, both with Republicans and Democrats, to get things done. And she's also somebody who has engaged me as a federal representative to see ways that we can work together to improve New York City for the better. And I'd like to take an opportunity to welcome my good friend, Councilwoman JoAnn Ariello. Thank you for coming again to Washington.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Tiffany, Ranking Member Neguse, and full committee Chairman Westerman, and of course, Representative Nicole Malliotakis and the members of this committee. Protection of public lands must not be a pendulum that swings back and forth depending on who's in office. It is not a partisan issue. These words were spoken by President Joe Biden just 2 years ago. In the time since they were spoken, however, the protection of our public lands seems to have become a very partisan issue. As a result of the grave mismanagement of the situation at our southern border, our cities have now become inundated with migrants for whom we have no room nor financial means to provide shelter to. In order to alleviate this situation, there are some in government who wish to place newcomers in our national parks, effectively closing those parks to the public and transforming them into housing compounds. This is something that we should all be united against. We should all recognize that the thought of transforming a place like Yosemite National Park into a sprawling tent city is something that should never stand. It is something that we need protection against, and that is the protection that comes with H.R. 5283. This is a protection that would not only cover national parks like Yellowstone or the Grand Canyon, but it is one that would cover each and every national park in the country as well. As Barack Obama once said, it's not just the iconic mountains and parks that we protect. It's the forests where generations of families have hiked and picnicked and connected with nature. It's the park down the street where the kids play after school. It's the farmland that has been in the family longer than anybody can remember. It's the rivers where we fish. It's the forests where we hunt. Those words are especially true today, even if that national park is seen by some as just an old airport in Brooklyn. That old airport in Brooklyn is Floyd Bennett Field. And it is especially important for the people of New York City and to the people of my district in particular. In a city which suffers from a lack of green space, Floyd Bennett Field draws on average nearly 1 million visitors each year to its meadows, fields, forests, and shorelines. Remote control aviation enthusiasts make use of the old runways. Students utilize the sporting fields and wait all year for field trips to the seasonal petting zoos and pumpkin patches. And families make use of the campgrounds to enjoy the thrill of gathering around a campfire and sleeping under the stars without ever having to leave the 5 boroughs. Fishermen dot the shorelines, momentarily forgetting about the stresses of their home lives while they hope for the next big catch. And bird watchers patrol the meadows in search of rare migrant bird species. All of these things stand to be in jeopardy should we allow Floyd Bennett Field to be transformed into a tent city for those crossing our southern border. Thousands of asylum seekers have been placed in the middle of the park would mean that the many daily visitors who rely on the urban oasis to get a fleeting glimpse of the great outdoors would be unable to do so. Sections of the park would be completely sealed off from the public, converted into tents and support facilities. The campgrounds would be made into an administrative center for the new complex. The runway turned into living space. The meadows suddenly too busy for activity for birds to arrive. The list of changes would go on and would radically alter the park as it is known and enjoyed today. That is why it is so vital that we act to protect this space and all other national parks. These places were meant to be enjoyed by all, not turned into temporary housing as a result of a complicated immigration issue thousands of miles away. And that is why I urge everyone to sign on to H.R. 5283 so that we can ensure our parks remain protected and that whatever fallout from any other political issues in the future do not jeopardize the amazing green spaces that are loved and enjoyed by millions of Americans all over the country. Thank you, and I'm willing to take any questions from the panel.
Yeah, thank you very much, Councilman Arreola. We really appreciate you coming back down to DC to testify once again. Next, we're going to recognize members for questions, alternating between majority and minority. And first, we'll have the chairman of the full committee, Mr. Westerman. You have 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Tiffany, and again, thank you to the witnesses. Councilmember Arreola, just over a year ago, on October 12th, 2022, President Biden stated that national parks are, quote, treasures and wonders that define the identity of us as a nation. They're a birthright that we pass down from generation to generation, and they unite us. In your experience, do you think the recent actions to establish migrant housing on National Park Service land in New York City has lived up to President Biden's ideas for national parks? And has this united your community in any way?
It is completely contrary to his statement, and it has not united our community. It has really divided it in the fact that they will no longer be able to utilize that green space.
That's my assessment as well. Mr. Hankinson, as I mentioned in my opening statement, federal lands are the areas that dangerous criminals and drug smugglers target because they know they are remote and under-patrolled. Your testimony touched on the impact that illegal aliens have on the country, including increased rates of crime. Can you expand on the effects that dangerous criminals who cross into our country on federal lands have on our society?
Thank you. I would say that criminality is pretty evenly spread among populations. The murder rate in the U.S. is about 5 in 100,000. The population crossing the border illegally skews younger and more male, and we have no records on them. If they don't have a criminal record in the United States, even if they surrender to Border Patrol and they get fingerprinted, we have no idea what their history is. And the fact is that if you get the daily CBP reports and ICE reports of arrests, many of these people that they're arresting who've committed crimes have been arrested multiple times and they've been deported once or more than once. And how do they get back in? They don't surrender at the border. They cross at one of the many places where it's easy not to be detected, and they disappear into that statistic of gotaways that I spoke about. So these are preventable crimes. You can't prevent all crime, but you can certainly make a difference by making an attempt to patrol the border and to catch people who are trying to come back in.
Thank you. And Deputy Chief Heithoker, President Obama's Homeland Security Secretary Janet Napolitano wrote in 2009 that environmental laws and designations such as wilderness areas that she was talking about, she, quote, said restrictions can impact the efficacy of Border Patrol operations and can be a hindrance to the maintenance of officer safety, end quote. The Forest Service's own testimony cites wilderness restrictions as reasons why the construction of a patrol road, which would enhance border security and officer safety, would be prohibited. Does the Forest Service agree with President Obama's own Homeland Security Secretary that restrictive designations like wilderness areas along our southern border can hurt the efficacy of Border Patrol operations and endanger officers?
Yeah, thank you for the question, Mr. Chairman. I would have to defer to CBP on efficacy of how they patrol those borders. As you know, that's not within our mission to respond to that.
And I know you mentioned the terrain would prevent roads, but if you look at the draft of the legislation, we're talking about being able to construct roads even as far as a mile off of the border to account for terrain. And I know that where there's a will, there's a way. You can build a road. We've built a lot of roads in some very treacherous terrain around the country. But if you don't have access, you're just have an open area with no way to enforce the laws that we have. Mr. Hankinson, Chairman Tiffany mentioned in his statement the amount of fentanyl that is illegally flowing into the country, an astonishing 25,500 pounds, just what we confiscated this last year. Under the Biden administration, we've seen record increases in fentanyl seizures. In your opinion, will we be able to stop the flow of fentanyl into this country if we don't secure our southern border?
No, and I wouldn't suggest that we could ever stop 100% of the flow of contraband and drugs into the country, but we could make a tremendous improvement on the situation now, which is that not only are drugs being stopped at ports of entry, but they're going around through individuals with backpacks right along the border where it's easy to cross. It's a percentages question, and I don't believe we could do a whole lot worse than we're doing now.
Yeah, and I actually was down there and saw migrants come across with 3 backpacks full of drugs, and the Border Patrol caught them. They dropped the drugs, and 2 of them made it back across before they could arrest them. And it happens every day, every hour. It's happening down there. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Westerman. Next, Mrs. Peltola, you have 5 minutes for questioning. There you go.
There we go. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good morning. This really is a serious issue, but I just, everybody in this room knows it. The viewing audience knows this. This issue did not invent itself in 2020. This is these immigration issues that we have with South America and south of our border have been going on since the 1980s. Policies enacted in the 1980s or acted upon by the administrations of that time, and it has only gotten worse. But aside from larger philosophical discussions on policy, I just want to ask Mr. Heithecker if he could elaborate a little bit on how this proposal pencils out in terms of both budget and timelines. My understanding from your testimony is that the road will cost $40 to $60 million. The average or the estimated yearly maintenance cost would be about $250,000 a year. And just recognizing that the major maintenance issues and deferred road maintenance issues that your department has is it now totals $7.66 billion, and I'm sure the meter's still running with inflation costs and all of that. And I believe that $7.66 billion already kind of piled up need, pent up need, is about 58% of your agency's entire deferred maintenance inventory. Can you explain that or elaborate on that, please?
Yeah, so are you specifically asking about the percentage of our deferred maintenance budget that is?
Yeah, and just the incongruency here of, this is an important issue, but in other committees, there is talk about making cuts to your agency and having a stagnant budget because of continuing resolutions and inflation being the thief in the night, all of these things, and how it just doesn't pencil out.
Yeah, thank you for the clarification there. As I mentioned in my opening statements, we take these border management issues very seriously. We obviously have problems that we need to deal with. Currently, for road maintenance, we have 380,000 miles of road that we have to maintain. We're funded at about 20% of the level that we need to maintain those roads. So adding additional roads just adds to that deficit across the board nationally.
So would the Forest Service be able to meet the requirements of ensuring border access and protection on federal lands and maintaining the existing inventory without an additional appropriation? And again, we all know this is not an appropriations committee, but if you could just speak to that.
Yeah, as I mentioned, we only have about 20% of the budget necessary to maintain the roads that we currently have, so we'll just be adding to that additional maintenance backlog.
And could you talk about the timeline that's specified in the bill and the actuality of meeting that?
As I mentioned, with the current resources we have, that timeline would be a challenge. We have to go through NEPA. We have to go through consultation with federally recognized tribes. And depending on the level of analysis and the impacts that we recognize, we could be looking at anywhere from 4 to 7 years to try and get that analysis and road analysis and NEPA completed.
Okay. There have been a couple comments about how the Secretary of Interior isn't here, and I just wondered if she had confirmed that she accepted the invitation to appear here, or if there might have been a scheduling conflict.
Yeah, all we know is that she's not here and no representative from Interior is here. I'm not sure how many employees there are in the Department of Interior, but I suspect they should be able to find someone that would attend a hearing, especially an important hearing like this.
I am glad that the Forest Service is here, and you are under the purview of the Department of Interior, so, I guess that's a good de facto person. And I guess, I'm not always in favor of the actions taken or not taken by the Department of Interior or the Secretary, but she is still a member of the administration's cabinet, and I just think it's good of us to maybe give her some grace in her absence. Thank you. She might be in Alaska. There's a huge convention going on up in Alaska right now, so I know she'll be there on Sunday. So Could just be that she's on the other side of the country.
Sure. Part of the message we received also is that they've appeared before this committee enough. So,
And maybe, and I'm just, guessing here, it might also be the treatment when she does appear here, the hollering and name calling and things like that.
yeah. So first of all, if it's before this subcommittee, no one is
true,
no one is hollering.
Yeah, good point.
No
Thank
one
you.
is name calling. Now, are there tough questions? No doubt about it. But there's a lot to be answered for, and I think that's the case here also.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I digress in these comments, but I thought they were
Gentleman yield.
worth it. Okay, thank you. I do yield.
Yeah, thank you. I'd like to recognize the gentleman from Idaho for 5 minutes, Mr.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Ms. Ariola, thank you for the testimony, and welcome to the fight on the challenge to secure the southern border. New York's got some geography between it and the southern border, and so does my home state of Idaho. And like you, we are impacted as well. And in my state, our governor recently designated a National Fentanyl Awareness Day, as opioid-related deaths have nearly doubled in Idaho over the last decade. In 2022, there were 358 overdose deaths, and 50% of those was from fentanyl. From July to August of this year, U.S. Customs and Border Protection seized more than 25,500 pounds of fentanyl, compared with 12,800 pounds over the same period in 22. And just as a reminder, that's in Idaho. It's a fair distance from the southern border. But nevertheless, it's impacting us as well. I can only imagine the drastic impact on states closer in proximity. I have been to the southern border as well, and this is just a drastic situation that we've got to do something about. I do have a question for Mr. Hankinson. In your testimony, you pointed out 5 major ways in which illegal immigration hurts America. I would just want to ask, with your research and given the negative impacts of fentanyl, like in my state, what are some of the steps that we can take to try to deal with that crisis?
Well, one thing we could do is put the Border Patrol back on the border. And one of the reasons they're not there in large numbers is because they're being pulled off to do processing of illegal, inadmissible aliens who are then being moved into the rest of the country. So we need to address that flow. We know that about 85% of them are not going to qualify for asylum because they're here looking for a job, which you can't blame them for doing, but you can certainly ask them to wait their asylum process in Mexico under the migrant protection protocols, or in a country where they've previously gained asylum or protection, right the way down through South America. And when we dismantled that and we accepted that every person asking to get in would be dealt with after they already were in the United States, we had to divert resources off the border. So one thing that could be done, a concrete thing, is to reinstate the migrant protection protocols and safe third country agreements and ways in which to process people outside the United States so that Border Patrol can get back to patrolling the border.
Thank you for that. And I shared with you, Mr. Hankinson, just a little snippet about some of the impacts we've seen in Idaho. And I know you've looked into this in depth. Are we unique, or you see similar ramifications in other local communities that have impacted other local communities?
Well, New York is obviously the biggest example, but across our big cities, Washington, D.C., there are over 1,000 people in Washington, D.C. shelters that are displacing people from Washington. There are tents all over this town. We've all seen them, including outside my apartment. There are 400 people living in Chicago Airport's bus terminal who are inadmissible aliens who've been let into the country, presumably to claim asylum at some point. Chicago is scrambling to figure out what to do with them all. El Paso has seen people released into its streets, sleeping on the sidewalks, more than, I think, 2 or 3 times since this crisis started. And then I was hearing yesterday that in Boise, There is a homeless population down by some sensitive areas in the river that used to be recreational grounds that everybody could enjoy. And the homeless populations all over the country are being exacerbated enormously by indigent illegal immigrants coming to the country who have to be taken care of by local communities.
Thank you for that. Mr. Chairman, I do have more questions, but I'm going to use the rest of my time just for a statement because Mr. Hankinson kind of covered a portion of the next question that I had. This is a result of this administration's policy. No more, no less. Not only is it critically unfair to Americans, this is horrifically bad for the immigrants. We legally immigrate more than every other nation in the world combined on an annual basis. To take the border and open it up, I would argue absolutely for political purposes, is a travesty. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you to the gentleman from Idaho, and now I'll take 5 minutes for questioning. I just want to piggyback on what Mr. Fulcher just talked about, because it was said earlier that this was not invented, this issue was not invented in 2020. So that's correct, but it has been put on overdrive here in America. And yesterday on the floor of the House, I think Representative Cole said it very well, always in his measured tones. When he talked about Jay Johnson, who was the secretary during the Biden administration, he defined a crisis as 1,000 people a day coming across the southern border illegally. There's now 10,000 a day. This is a direct result of January 20th of 2021, when President Biden announced that there will be open borders to the world, and everyone heard that. And all the maladies that come with that are happening, including trashing our federal lands down on the southern border. Well, and in New York City and many other places. I mean, it is a direct result of one person's actions and one administration's actions. Mr. Heithaker, why are you here today?
Well, you asked me to be here. That's one reason, and to represent the stance that the U.S. Forest Service has.
To testify on behalf of the Forest Service, right?
Absolutely.
And the Forest Service is testifying today because you received an invitation from the subcommittee to be here today over 2 weeks ago, which you complied with, correct?
Correct.
Can you think of any reason why the Forest Service was able to show up and testify before us today when your colleagues at the Department of Interior were unable to do so?
I can't speak to why the Park Service isn't here, but I'm happy to be here and happy to answer your questions.
Is U.S. Forest Service housing illegal immigrants? You said something about funds for housing that are being allocated from the Forest Service. Is the Forest Service using funds to house illegal immigrants?
No, we're not.
Not even indirectly?
Nope.
You said that some of this bill that we introduced, the Trash Act, is already provided under the law, that it's unnecessary, right? So why isn't it being enforced?
If you look at our numbers of law enforcement, we have roughly 400, little over 400 law enforcement officers in the field. That's over 193 million acres. You can do the math on the challenges there that they have in patrolling those lands. It's difficult.
Does the Forest Service ever work with the Department of Homeland Security in any way?
We work very closely with Homeland Security as well as Customs and Border Protection.
Shouldn't they be enforcing? You say it's already provided under the law. Shouldn't they be enforcing this if you can't?
Are you asking, should Customs and Border Protection be providing protection over the environmental laws?
Should they be enforcing a law to not allow people to be able to come across the southern border illegally on federal lands that are under your jurisdiction?
Yes, they currently do. And that's part of an agreement that we've had in place for over 15 years now with Customs and Border Protection.
So they have control of the southern border?
they have jurisdiction to implement their laws that they follow on the southern border on National Forest System lands.
'Cause you're not saying what Secretary Mayorkas said, that, yes, we have control of the southern border, when the head of the Border Patrol said this year, we no longer have operational control of the southern border. You wouldn't be making the same statement as Secretary Mayorkas, would you?
If I understand what you're asking correctly, no, we have acknowledged that there is a huge and significant border management issue down there.
Thank you. Ms. Ariola, how have things changed since the last time you were here? How long ago was that? Was that 2 months ago?
It was less, it was just a few weeks ago.
Just a few weeks ago. Have things changed for the better in New York City?
They have not. Our numbers have risen to 119,600 that we have in our care, and over 126,000 total if you count the gotaways.
Okay, so the situation is getting worse in New York City.
It's getting worse every day. We're getting anywhere from 800 to 1,000 migrants per week.
There was a representative from New York who said just last week that we should allow Palestinian refugees into America, and in particular, they would be welcomed in New York City. Do you think that's a good idea to do that at this time?
I do not. There is no more room in New York City.
Thank you. My time is up here. I really appreciate that all of you would share your testimony. We have no other members of the panel that are here that want to question. So thank you very much for your valuable testimony. And members, for your questions. Members of subcommittee may have some additional questions for our witnesses today, and we will ask that they respond to these in writing. Under Committee Rule 3, members of the subcommittee must submit questions to the subcommittee clerk by 5 p.m. on Tuesday, October 24th, 2023. The hearing record will be held open for 10 business days for those responses, if you choose to do them. If there is no further business, without objection, the Subcommittee on Federal Lands stands adjourned.